In the early morning of October 7th, 2023, as Jews prepared to celebrate the festival of Simchat Torah, thousands of Hamas militants and civilians from Gaza stormed across the border into southern Israel and massacred at least 1,200 civilians and took 250 Israelis into captivity back into Gaza. The attack was accompanied by thousands of missile launches from Gaza itself. The siege, which included instances of rape and horrific mutilation, prompted a subsequent invasion by the Israeli military into Gaza to secure the nation's borders and eradicate the Hamas threat. A year on, Israel remains in Gaza, where it has mostly routed out Hamas, as well as destroyed or dismantled the hundreds of miles of elaborate tunnels used by its leadership. Israel's military response has resulted in an estimated yet unconfirmed 40,000 deaths, both civilians and militants. There have also been hundreds of thousands of Gazans who've been displaced from their homes, a consequence of Hamas's deadly strategy of embedding its militants in homes, schools, mosques, and hospitals as its leaders cower in luxury hotels in Qatar. Hamas has spent billions of dollars in international aid to fund its terror campaigns and tunnel infrastructure. The Gaza war is now Israel's longest ever, with nearly 700 soldiers killed and thousands more wounded. It is also stretched far beyond Israel and Gaza. Houthi rebels from Yemen joined in to attack both Red Sea oil tankers as well as Israel itself. Iran, patron of Hamas, the Houthis and Hezbollah, launched a comprehensive missile barrage on Israel in April. And now Hezbollah, which began firing upon Israel's north almost immediately after Hamas's October 7th massacre, is engaged in what is likely to be a full-scale war. And helping me make sense of it all are New York Post reporters Jon Levine, Isabel Vincent, along with Mark Cunningham, editorial page editor. And we'll be joined later in the program by New York Post columnist Douglas Murray. This war is now Israel's longest, extending almost a year. On October 7th, nobody could have imagined that it would infiltrate into the US, throughout the Middle East, and really around the globe. Why is it exactly that it's been so difficult for Israel to end this war, which few would have thought had taken this long?
Well, I mean, the main reason, of course, is that Washington, President Biden, has kept slowing them down, has kept saying, no, you're doing too much. No, you have to reduce civilian casualties. No, you can't go into Rafah. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. The simple fact is that Israel certainly hoped to be done by now.
Who exactly is pressuring Washington to take this sort of anti-Israel stance?
Well, obviously, Biden is concerned about U.S. opinion, specifically, well, he was still in the race, and now that Harris is in the race, they're worried about a few tens of thousands of Muslim and Arab American voters in Michigan and Minnesota. They are obsessed with those voters, and generally the left wing, a good chunk of the Democratic Party, thinks that Israel's use of force to defend itself is bad, including most of the media faction that buys every story of, oh my God, Israel's committing war crimes. Israel has not been committing war crimes. Nothing they've done. They've done a great job of minimizing civilian casualties in urban warfare. Unprecedented, actually.
A similar number or a similar cohort of folks who are pressuring Washington to put the brakes on Israel's war effort. John, we're seeing a lot of those same people on the streets here in New York and across the country protesting. When did they appear and what have they been doing?
Right, well, I can't really say I was surprised by Hamas's terrorist attack in Israel because they are a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel.
Right.
It was a little bit disconcerting that there were the security failures in Israel which allowed them to come in. But we've also seen that before with things like in 9/11 in our own country. I remember the memo, bin Laden determined to attack America. But what really did surprise me was the reaction in this country.
When did it begin?
It began on October 8th.
Uh-huh.
It began on October 8th, the very day after, while you were still fighting terrorists in Israel proper, you had people in Times Square. There was a massive pro-Hamas rally in Times Square. And I don't say pro-Palestinian. I say pro-Hamas because that is the elected government of Gaza. It is popular opinion polls show overwhelming support by the people for the government they elected. And I sort of attribute it to two things.
Yeah.
Number one, we have imported, especially since 9/11, a lot of foreign ideologies and demographics in the form of new arrivals to our country. The Wall Street Journal called Dearborn, Michigan, the jihad capital of America, and you can look at the number of people arrested there for terrorism-related crimes to see why. And also, it's coming from academia, where there's been a long history on the academic left that Israel does not have a right to exist, that Zionism is racism, and that Israel itself is essentially a colonial project, and it's a sort of last gasp of that era, And what Hamas is doing is justified. There was a poll conducted by Signal Polling, which is an A-rated by Nate Silver's 538, and they found that 57% of American Muslims believe that what Hamas did in Israel on October 7th was, quote, justified.
And talk about, all three of you, the role of anti-Semitism and the specter of fear that Jews have experienced in New York since then, since October 7th. Obviously, New York has been traditionally associated as a safe haven for Jews, but we've seen Jews under attack, under assault in ways that were unimaginable even a year or two ago. How has this manifested itself? And more importantly, why has this been allowed to continue?
Well, I mean, anti-Semitism is sort of what's underneath everything. It's the bedrock that fuels all of this. And, you can never get rid of anti-Semitism in the world. It's been around for thousands of years. It is not eradicatable. But what you can do with laws and policies and good government is to basically keep it to a level where it doesn't impact the population. And so what you often hear people say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. But if you don't believe in the right of a state where most of the Jews in the world live to exist, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so anti-Zionism is just, you're anti-Semitic with a thesaurus. And what the war in Gaza has done is it's allowed a lot of people with these feelings who not otherwise could bring them forward in polite society to give them an outlet to voice them.
How?
And you're seeing that.
What have they been doing exactly? And what to you has felt like
From the river to the sea, which is this is a genocidal chant that was created by Hamas. The river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean. By the way, they don't know any of that.
The protesters don't. Yeah. They just like the sound of it.
And the Hamas created the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, from the river to the sea, you tell me where Israel's going to be when Palestine is free, and I'll tell you right now, it's not going to be anywhere. In the sea. And there were Jews in every single Arab Muslim country before the foundation of Israel in 1948, and they were all chased out at the point of a gun, and they went to Israel. And if Israel had not existed, who only knows what would have happened to them?
So much of these protests and the language and the narrative around these protests has really borrowed from woke ideology, intersectionality. You've seen a surprisingly large number of feminists come out in support of Hamas, of LGBT groups come out in support of Hamas, even though Hamas's charter and their religious ideology clearly have no space for feminism, let alone gays and lesbians. How is it possible that folks directly in the shooting range of Hamas have come out to support this Islamist violent terrorist organization?
I am not an expert in mental illness. I cannot explain to you why you have all these people, trans for Hamas when they would literally kill you on sight. I often say, please organize a gay pride parade in Gaza. I would love to see it. I think someone offered $1 million to finance it if they could actually get it going. Look, I think a lot of this is cultural. I think it's a lot of the Facebook groups you're in and the circles you run in, and there's no education. Nobody knows anything. You can't talk about the second intifada or the first intifada to someone who's 20 years old today because they weren't alive for it. Right. And they're certainly not learning it in schools. And they don't know that these people have been trying to destroy Israel from day one since 1948. They've lost repeatedly. And as Golda Meir said, if they would lay down their arms, there would be peace. If we laid down our arms, we would be killed.
Right, and you got to understand it's sort of this modern generic leftism where every cause blurs into every other cause, and somehow you're not truly for the right things unless you embrace every item on the checklist. Because Israel is successful, sort of the left in the academia turned against it, pretended it's this quote-unquote settler colonialist enterprise, when in fact most of its population, their ancestors never left the Middle East. They came in from other countries in the pogroms after the founding, but you look at Israelis, you see an incredible ethnic diversity. Right. Just the thought that anti-Israel has become a global lefty thing is bizarre. Israel's so progressive in so many ways.
Let's talk a bit about the rest, the mainstream media here, the major players. I mean, so much of the narrative around this war has been parroted by a select number of media who seem to agree and promote anything that Hamas has said. Why have they been allowed to get away with this?
Well, again, it's a free country. Yeah. Unfortunately, they're using their freedom badly and stupidly.
One of the things that I've documented in the last few years is how many professors, like loony professors who have these crazy pedigrees, Progressive places like Oberlin College has this professor who cheered on the fatwa for Salman Rushdie, was a diplomat in Iran who, sort of presided over the death of all these political prisoners. These people are celebrated in academia. I don't understand that.
Speaking of Iran, I mean, they have really been sort of the 800-pound gorilla and a monster in the backstory of this entire conflict. We've been expecting Iran to retaliate against Israel for the August attack in Tehran on one of Hamas's leaders, but that hasn't happened. What is Iran's game plan here? Why have they been able to maintain such a simmering presence in this conflict without necessarily acting to the best of their ability?
Well, I mean, they don't want to get active. They don't want their forces actively involved. They want Israel to fight its proxies, exhaust itself against its proxies. Meanwhile, Iran is going nuclear. So they're very happy for everybody to be distracted while they do that. And of course, the Biden administration is cluelessly playing along. If they actually attack Israel, Israel is likely to attack back, and they can at least devastate Iran's oil industry, which is the overwhelming source of hard currency, and potentially set back the nuclear program some. It's hard to say how much. Iran basically had to have agreed to let Hamas go ahead at the start. There's plenty of evidence that they helped plan the whole thing. They basically gave the go-ahead to do it because they were worried that Israel was about to make peace with the Saudis.
Right.
Having Hamas launch this war sidetracked that agreement, because the Biden administration had fallen down and abandoned the Trump policies of fostering agreements between Israel and the Arab states, frozen things for a while. Iran then sort of said, they're getting back to it on their own. We got to do something.
And one of the most interesting things about this period is that the Abraham Accords, we just celebrated the anniversary, has maintained its durability. None of the states that signed peace agreements with Israel, the UAE, Morocco, they've kept their peace. Why has this peace been able?
Well, money talks. I mean, the short answer is, even if you look at in Egypt, which has been at peace with Israel since 1979, they had a Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, who avowedly against Israel, and he kept the peace treaty in place because there's a lot of cross-border trade, and I think places like the UAE and Morocco and maybe one day Saudi Arabia realize that there's a lot of money to be gained by being a friend of Israel and being a much better friend of the United States. But on the two...
And not they're all worried about Iran. Iran wants to be the regional hegemon. Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood, which also wants to take out all the regimes.
When you look at the respective policies of President Trump and President Biden on the Middle East, I mean, it's shockingly stark. President Trump, first thing he did, he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
Both parties have been promising that since 1996, and then they went back on it, and he did it. And the Palestinians were quiet as mouse. He defunded the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, known as UNRWA, U.S. funding, whose members took part in October 7th, and that organization has been repeatedly tied to terrorism. He pulled the plug. President Biden brought the money back when he took over.
One of the biggest surprises that the IDF discovered, as really well the whole world, is that Hamas had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of elaborately built tunnels in which their leadership has hidden, as well as the hostages.
And all their fighters are in their tunnels.
Right.
I mean,
The
it's
fighters,
$1 billion
under the hospitals,
under schools, under UN buildings.
And how many bomb shelters for Palestinian civilians? Zero.
None.
So
not one.
Okay, so how were these tunnels built? What funded these tunnels? Where did this money come from?
From Qatar. I mean, like billions and billions of dollars have gone to those Hamas leaders. Now, whether the government of Qatar meant for that money to be used in that way, I don't know. But that's what.
But
that's
if
what
you give
ended
money
up
to a
happening.
terrorist group,
Fungible. What do you
Exactly.
expect?
And how important, how vital have these tunnels been in maintaining this war?
Super vital. I mean,
it's everything.
like, everything went through the tunnels. The tunnels, the hostages were in the tunnels. Because when you're bombing Gaza, you're safe in the tunnels, presumably. The tunnels were under the hospitals. The tunnels were under the schools.
Yeah, the tunnels are a key component of Hamas's
For
strategy
sure.
of embedding its war machine in civilian targets.
It's such a tricky thing because these tunnels are all made of concrete. And after this war is over, the first thing they're going to do is cry about how they need humanitarian aid. And a lot of humanitarian aid comes in the form of concrete and other dual-use items. And look, concrete builds a lot of humanitarian
if
things.
Hamas is in control.
Exactly.
I mean, Israel won't end the war until Hamas is effectively destroyed, but it can potentially reconstitute itself. There's still the huge question of what the post-war governance is going to be, and even of who's going to control the southern border of Hamas. Of course, one of the controversies now is the Philadelphia corridor.
Right. Why is that so important, Mark?
Well, because it's where the supplies centrally can come in through Egypt, through these tunnels, which Egypt, despite what it had promised, in various treaties, let Hamas build. I mean, there's highways across the border that allow, weapons primarily to come in. If there's going to be a peaceful Gaza post-war, those tunnels can't stay open. Egypt has proven it can't be trusted to keep them closed, unfortunately, whether it's corruption or something else.
Right.
And what about Israel itself? I've been to Israel twice now since October 7th. I mean, this is a country that is now a country on war footing for a period of time that has never existed. How has this war fundamentally changed Israel, do you think?
It's a very difficult question. I think there's a lot of resolve in Israel to really to get it done this time.
Yeah.
Now it's them or us. We're in that era. But at the same time, there's a lot of internal divisions in Israel that we can't, sugarcoat.
It's a democracy.
It's a democracy. So there were thousands, and maybe tens of thousands, in the street just recently demanding that Netanyahu cut a deal to bring the hostages home. And now my heart goes out to those people because it's their people who are held captivity. And I can't think of anything worse than being a hostage in Gaza of Hamas. And at the same time, unfortunately, those Israelis are playing into Hamas's strategy to push the Israeli government to prematurely end the war, which leaves the terrorists in power.
Is Netanyahu's commitment to a complete victory attainable? What does that victory look like?
Well, Hamas has to go. A brick-and-mortar organization like Al-Qaeda and ISIS before it, Hamas is gone. As for post-war reconstruction and who's in charge, it's clearly unclear. And I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't think it's been articulated yet.
Right, but I don't try to figure out internal Israeli politics. The left in this country keeps trying to pretend, Netanyahu's prolonging the war so that he can stay in power. I don't think that's it. The Israelis could oust him if there was a consensus to do that, but there's no clear talent to replace him. Israelis understand this war is necessary. They know that Hamas immediately after October 7th, even as Israel was coming in, was saying, yes, we'll do this again and again and again if we can. Our purpose is October 7th, October 7th, October 7th, until the Jews leave, or until there are no more Jews some other way.
And we're 6 weeks away from the U.S. election. Now, the last few weeks, we've seen a bit of a tampering down of a focus on Israel and Gaza and Palestine on the election. But how important is this going to be for, say, a Trump or a Harris win? What do you think, Isabel?
I think it's super important, and I think we have to look at where, talking about the campus protests, they're starting up again. They're, this hasn't ended. Like, anti-Semitism is still a big concern.
Will Jews who have traditionally voted Democrat, will they align themselves behind Trump this year?
That I don't know.
Yeah. A little bit more than last
maybe
time,
a little bit
but
more,
not a critical.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
No.
a lot of American Jews are no longer that concerned about Israel. Some of the left are basically anti-Israel at this point. I think it's clear to anybody who looks at this at all carefully, Harris will be worse than Biden for Israel.
Why?
Because Biden is of a generation, he grew up as a pro-Israel Democrat. He's shifted with the party, but his instincts were formed then. Harris is a California lefty.
But she's married to a Jew.
Well,
So what?
I mean, some of the most vocal anti-Israel and frankly anti-Semitic people you will see on these college campuses are Jewish people. And you can always, the tell is always, before they say anything, they say, as a Jew.
As a Jew.
Whenever you hear as a Jew, you know you're about to hear something crazy.
Oh, also, Emhoff's daughter
Right.
is
Psychotic.
Oh, that's right.
And
Yeah.
the niece openly raising money for UNRWA, which
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
United
That's right.
States, President Biden, after funding, then took the funding away because of their involvement in October 7th.
Now, we've seen, as a result of this war, the anti-Semitism, not just on college campuses, not just in marches across the country, but infiltrate, as we talked about the academy, but also pop culture, Hollywood culture,
It's
all
become
kinds of culture.
okay to be an
It's been
anti-Semite.
fetishized. Yeah,
It's
it's normalized
unbelievable.
now.
When
Yeah.
if and when this war ends, will this genie go back in the bottle?
No.
No, a lot of irrevocable damage has been done. There's no question.
Well, no, I mean, more importantly, again, you're right, anti-Semitism is ancient and so on and so forth, but this modern left-wing brand of it, we're going to have to face that even when Israel is safe or when it's not an issue.
Now, the last few days have seen this shift between in Israel from the battlefront being in the south with Hamas and Gaza to it being in the north with Hezbollah. When I was in Israel in August, I woke up one day and 100 Israeli fighter jets had taken out thousands of Hezbollah missiles in southern Lebanon that were about to attack me and kill me 15 minutes later. And now, a month later, we have these thousands of pagers blown up essentially by Israel to take out these Hezbollah bad guys. Are you surprised by the extent of Israel's preventative resolve in Lebanon?
Not remotely. 1960, the 67 war was a preemptive war because Egypt was about to invade and they got the planes on the tarmac. So there's a long history in Israel using preventative, preemptive strikes to prevent a much uglier conflict. And the fact is, 73, the Yom Kippur War, they wanted to do that too, but actually Nixon held them back. Israel has an obligation as a nation to defend its people. And unfortunately, they're surrounded by a lot of genocidal maniacs that want them all dead. So I don't know what measures are appropriate or responsible, but I would say it's a very high bar because you're surrounded by people that want to kill you.
Well, Hezbollah has been shooting 7,000, 8,000 missiles into Israel since October 7th. They've basically forced 60,000 people to evacuate from the north. They killed, those Druze kids.
Right.
To describe what took place here is to describe a massacre. Kids were playing soccer when a Hezbollah rocket slammed into this field. You can see the impact site right here.
As we wind up here, why do you, despite the viciousness, the bloodiness, the spectacle of October 7th, the rapes, the murders, the burnings, why is it so hard for the global community to accept the fact that Islamist terrorists want Israel dead?
And want the West dead generally. I mean,
Yeah.
we're next.
I think partly they've been overthrown by a lot of the same toxic, anti-Western, self-loathing ideologies that emanate out of academia. Europe feels incredibly guilty, not just about the wars, that World War I, World War II, but also the colonialism. And part of that is when you've convinced people that Israel is a colonial project, you're going to have natural sort of institutional objections to a state like Israel from the Europe of today. It's not across the board. Believe it or not, Germany has been among the better countries because it's central to the modern German state to support Israel and to support Jewish people, given their history. But, you have other places. The UK is gone.
Ireland.
France is an emirate. Ireland, don't even talk to me.
Well, no, I mean, and there is, the remnants of old school anti-Semitism
That's absolutely.
salted throughout
Yeah.
the European elites.
How does this war in Gaza end?
I mean, we know Hamas needs to go. I think that you can't totally abandon the idea of a two-state solution, even though in practice it is central to Palestinian self-identity, the negation of Israel. The negation of Israel is central to their identity. It's the reverse is not central to Jewish-Israeli identity. They cannot accept a state alongside Israel. Even if you gave them a state, the rockets would still keep coming.
They were given opportunities for states
They've
over
had
and over
many, many
again.
opportunities. So that ship has sailed.
No, you're going to need some sort of caretaker government, which is not democratically based, because the Palestinian population, has basically been weaponized for, 80 years by the Arab world thinking that they would use it as as a weapon against Israel, B, as a source of legitimacy for their own not remotely democratic regimes. It was a distraction to their own populaces.
Right.
You're going to have to figure out a way that Palestinians can become more normal, not just taught hate from cradle to grave.
Nobody alive currently in Gaza or the West Bank is going to be able to be part of a functioning Palestinian state. It's going to have to be generations unborn that are not totally poisoned by the current climate environment.
We're now joined by New York Post columnist Douglas Murray, who has spent much of the past year in Israel and has seen the conflict in Gaza evolved into a war across the Middle East. You were on the ground in Israel almost immediately. You've been obviously a Middle East observer for a very long time, but what surprised you most about what you saw in southern Israel in the early days and weeks following the Hamas attack?
Well, there was one question which I've had on my mind the last year and all Israelis have on their minds, which is how did this happen? Mm-hmm. And if I was to reduce that to one question, it's the thing that many survivors of the massacres of the 7th told me in the hospitals and elsewhere in the aftermath, which was that they told their children, don't worry, the IDF will be here in minutes. And they weren't.
Where was the IDF?
There'll be a commission of inquiry at some point and they'll work out what happened. The fact is that 50 years on, almost exactly 50 years on from the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel's enemies tried again. Mm-hmm. They surprised them again. They surprised them on a Jewish religious holiday where many people were off their phones, many people had been allowed to leave their bases in the south and go back to join their families. Warnings had been ignored, it seems. And then, as far as I can see, what happened was there was such confusion that the scramble of the army and others south, by the way, a scramble first of all of volunteers who just found guns and went and fought, and a lot of people I know did that, and a lot of very, very brave Israelis.
Fought for their own homes.
Fought for their own homes and went and fought for other people's homes. Mm-hmm. I know people who drove, the minute they realized the seriousness of it, defied orders even to be called back to base, went down and started fighting Hamas there and then. But there were still very big questions to be asked about the intelligence failing, the military failing, the air force failing. And this has been the question that all Israelis have had for the last year. How could this happen with the deterrent effect we've had? I think we can now say, a year on from the 7th, that Israel's deterrent capability is back and that the Israeli public are on the way to being reassured that they are safe in their homes and in their homeland.
Despite the fact that the last few weeks have seen an unprecedented increase in missile attacks, both from Lebanon, Hezbollah, and now from Iran. Do you think people in Israel feel like they're on a path towards victory?
Well, the destruction of almost all the top commander of Hezbollah is certainly a good sign. Most extraordinarily, when Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking at the United Nations, it seemed he ordered the strike on Hassan Nasrallah, who thought that because Benjamin Netanyahu was out of Jerusalem that he would be safe. And the Israelis took out Nasrallah, the leader of, and a spiritual leader as well as a military leader of Hezbollah, and at the same time taking out almost all of its munitions in southern Lebanon. There's a very important point that should be made on this. Some of the commanders who have been killed by the IDF in recent days were the people who killed 241 US Marines in the Beirut barrack bombings in 1983. America, the French government, which also lost a large number of troops to Hezbollah, other international countries that lost significant numbers of their foreign nationals to this Iranian terror organization, never managed to revenge the killing of our people. Israel ended up doing it for them 40 years later. And there's something to be said about that that's important. When Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress in July, he said something which I think all Americans should keep in mind, because it was not a piece of rhetoric. He said, our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory.
As we sort of conclude here, I want to ask, you've spent a lot of time actually in Israel during this past year, really on the ground with the people of Israel. We talk a lot about Israel fighting this battle, Israel fighting the battle against Hezbollah, against Iran, against Hamas, fighting for the West. But what about the actual Israelis, the people who live there? How have you seen them faring during this time? And how do you see them sort of faring as we reach this anniversary of October 7th and over the next year?
When you ask, how they feel, are they still going to have resolve? There's one good story that Joe Biden tells. He's told it a lot. But it's his first encounter with Golda Meir, a long time ago, when she said to him famously, "You know, Senator, we have a secret weapon." And he thought she was going to say, "We do have the nuke." And she leaned over to him and said, "We have nowhere else to go."
There's no plan B.
In Israel, it's the one place on earth where Jews know they have the right to defend themselves. So there is no plan B. Best thing to be hoped for is that the next generation of Israelis will not have to step up and fight like this one has, because the Iranian revolutionary government in Tehran will be gone, because its terror proxies will be gone, and an actual future for the Middle East can be envisaged in which people live normally side by side, and people do not have to, in villages in the south in Israel, or villages in the north in Israel, or an average home in Tel Aviv, do not have to have a bomb shelter because of regular rocket fire from their neighbors. There's another way of doing this.
A year after the Hamas attack on Israel, Douglas Murray tells us what a future for the Middle East and Israel might look like: a future without war, where folks can live in their homes safely and without bomb shelters. We thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It's a great pleasure.
Your time. Thank you.
Thank you.